poisoned cup, a stolen bloodline, a servant girl who would rather die than betray the family that once threw her out. Stay until the end, because the person everyone blames is the only one who never lied. Somewhere in the north wing of Aldrich Hall, a bottle of wine sat wrapped in velvet, waiting to be opened. It looked like a gift. It was not. The man who sent it smiled when he pictured the Duke's hand closing around the glass. He imagined the color draining from that proud face, the confusion, the silence that follows a man realizing he has been killed by his own trust. He did not imagine a different hand reaching for that cup first. He did not imagine a physician bending low over a dying friend, unaware that the same poison waited on the rim he touched. He did not imagine a boy asleep in his bed, 3 doors down, utterly unaware that he was the true target, the last obstacle between a bitter, disinherited lord and a fortune that was never his to take. And he certainly did not imagine a girl in the servants' quarters, a girl he had already tried to kill once, quietly deciding that she would not run, that she would stay, that she would protect a family that did not even know how many times she had already saved them. This is the story of Aldrich Hall, of a curse meant for one man that fell on 2, of a steward torn between loyalty and a dying daughter, of a theft that never happened, and of the woman blamed for it, who had given up everything and asked for nothing. Keep watching, because before this ends, the Duke will destroy the one person who never betrayed him, and he won't even realize it until it's almost too late. Aldrich Hall rose out of the misted hills like something carved rather than built, its grey stone towers catching the last amber light of evening. Inside, servants moved through the halls carrying candles, and somewhere in the kitchens, a delivery had just arrived. A single bottle of wine, dark red glass, sealed with wax the color of dried blood. No note, no signature, only a small card that read, "For the Duke, from an old friend who wishes him strength." The kitchen steward who received it thought nothing of it. Gifts arrived at Aldrich Hall often, from allies, from petitioners, from distant relations hoping to be remembered kindly. He placed the bottle in the cellar among the others and thought no more of it. He did not know that 30 miles away, in a candle-lit study lined with maps and old grudges, a man named Lord Callum Fenwick was already counting the hours until the Duke would be dead. Fenwick was not a monster by birth. He had once been a favoured cousin of the Aldrich line, raised alongside the Duke's own father, promised, or so he always believed, a share of the family's fortune that never came. When the inheritance passed instead to the Duke's branch of the family, Fenwick had smiled through gritted teeth at the wedding, smiled through the christening of the Duke's son, smiled through every polite dinner and every carriage ride, all while a single thought calcified inside him, like poison hardening into stone. This should have been mine. He had waited years. He had built alliances quietly, borrowed money he had no intention of repaying honestly, and cultivated the kind of patience that only truly bitter men can sustain. And now, with the Duke's health already fragile from years of grief after his wife's death, Fenwick believed the final piece had fallen into place. The wine was enchanted, not poisoned in the way a physician might detect, but cursed by a hedge witch Fenwick had paid handsomely and threatened even more handsomely to ensure her silence. The curse would not kill quickly. That was the cruelty of it. It would unravel a man's mind slowly, filling his nights with visions, his days with tremors, until those who loved him would almost welcome his death as a mercy. By midwinter, Fenwick murmured to himself, swirling his own glass of ordinary wine, "Aldrich Hall will belong to whoever is left standing, and I intend to be the one holding the boy's hand when it happens." He did not say Theo's name aloud. Even alone, even in the privacy of his own study, some small, shriveled part of him could not yet bring himself to speak of harming a child directly. That would come later. For now, the wine was enough. He had no way of knowing that the bottle would never reach the Duke's lips at all. Lord Ashby had been the Duke's closest friend since childhood. The kind of friendship built not on convenience, but on decades of shared grief and shared laughter. The kind that survives wars, deaths, and long absences without ever needing to be spoken of directly. When Ashby arrived at Aldrich Hall that evening, weary from travel and glad to see his old friend again, the Duke ordered wine brought up from the cellar to celebrate. The servant sent to fetch it did not know which bottle was which. In the dim cellar light, one dark bottle looked much like another, and the unmarked gift, still without any warning label, still wrapped in the same anonymous velvet, was carried up along with 3 ordinary bottles. It was poured, almost carelessly, into 2 cups. The Duke, distracted by a letter that had just arrived from a neighboring estate, did not drink his immediately. He set the cup down on the table beside him, intending to return to it once he had finished reading. Ashby, thirstier and less patient, drank his in 3 long swallows, and reached for more. By the time the Duke finally lifted his own cup an hour later, Ashby had already had 2 full glasses from the cursed bottle, and the Duke's cup was refilled from an entirely different, uncontaminated one, poured by a servant clearing the table. Fate, or luck, or simple household chaos had spared the man Fenwick meant to kill and doomed the one he never intended to touch. It began subtly. Ashby laughed less that night than usual, complained of a headache, and excused himself early. The Duke thought nothing of it. Men grow tired after long journeys. It was only the following morning, when Ashby failed to appear for breakfast, that the first flicker of alarm passed through the household. A servant found him in his chambers, curled on the floor beside his bed, his whole body trembling, his eyes open but unseeing, muttering words that made no sense in a voice that did not sound entirely like his own. The Duke was at his side within minutes. "Ashby, Ashby, look at me." He gripped his friend's shoulders, tried to steady the shaking, but Ashby's gaze slid past him, as if the Duke were made of mist. "What happened to you?" Ashby's lips moved. What came out was not an answer, but a whisper, cracked and terrified. "They're in the walls. They're in the walls. Can't you see them?" The Duke had seen fevers before. He had seen madness in old soldiers and grief-stricken widows. He had never seen anything like this, the sheer wrongness of it, the way Ashby's pupils seemed to swallow the color from his eyes, the way his skin had gone the pale gray of old candle wax. "Fetch the physician," the Duke ordered, and his voice, though steady, carried an edge his household had rarely heard before. Now, the family physician, a careful and aging man named Dr. Merrow, had served Aldrich Hall for over 20 years. He had delivered the Duke's own son. He had sat beside the Duke's wife in her final days. He was not a man given to panic, and when he examined Lord Ashby that morning, his brow furrowed with the particular concentration of a doctor encountering something entirely outside his experience. "His pulse is erratic," Merrow murmured, more to himself than to the Duke, who hovered anxiously in the doorway. "His pupils do not respond correctly to light, and this—" He lifted one of Ashby's hands, showing faint gray veins spidering beneath the skin of his wrist. "This is not consistent with any fever or poison I have encountered. Can you help him?" Merrow did not answer immediately, which was, in itself, an answer the Duke did not want to hear. "I will do what I can," the physician said finally, "but I confess, Your Grace, I do not yet know what I am fighting." He worked through the day and into the night, mixing tinctures, bleeding small amounts of blood to examine, murmuring old remedies half-remembered from his training. At one point, exhausted and thirsty, he reached for a cup left on the bedside table, the very cup Ashby had drunk from the night before, still bearing the faint residue of cursed wine along its rim, and drank without thinking. It was such a small, human mistake, the kind anyone exhausted and distracted might make. By the next morning, Dr. Merrow was shaking too. the household fell into a kind of quiet horror. Two men, one the Duke's dearest friend, the other the physician meant to save them all, now lay in adjoining chambers, their minds slipping further from reach with each passing hour. Servants whispered of witchcraft. Some crossed themselves when passing the sick-room doors. The Duke, for his part, refused to believe in curses until he had exhausted every rational explanation. And exhausted them he did, calling in every herbalist and scholar within a day's ride, none of whom could offer anything beyond helpless shrugs and grim prognoses. It was his old nursemaid, a woman near 80 years old, who had served the family longer than the Duke had been alive, who finally spoke the words no one else dared to. "This is no fever, my lord," she said quietly, finding him alone in the hallway outside the sick room, his face haggard from 2 sleepless nights. "I have seen this before, many years ago, in another household. This is a curse, and there is only one soul in these hills who might know how to break it." "Who?" "Old Marin," the nursemaid whispered, as if the name itself required care. "The healer, who lives past the hollow wood. Some call her a witch, some call her worse, but if anyone can save your friend and your physician, my lord, it is her." The Duke had never believed in witches. He had never believed, if he was honest with himself, in very much beyond what could be seen, touched, and reasoned through. But watching Ashby's trembling hands, hearing Merrow murmur incoherent fragments of prayers and nonsense in the next room, he found his certainty crumbling by the hour. By dawn, he had made his decision. He would go to old Marin himself. The road to the hollow wood was one the Duke had never traveled, though he had lived his entire life within a day's ride of it. It was the kind of place polite society pretended did not exist, a tangle of ancient trees where the light fell strange and green, where locals left small offerings at the tree line out of habit rather than belief, just in case the old stories carried some grain of truth after all. He went alone, against the pleading of his household, taking only a single manservant and 2 horses laden with what little he thought might be useful: gold, in case payment was required, and a written account of Ashby's symptoms, in case description alone might mean something to a healer's trained eye. Old Marin's cottage sat at the heart of the wood, half swallowed by ivy, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. She was waiting for him before he even reached the door, a small, weathered woman with eyes the color of river stone, who looked at the Duke as though she had been expecting him for years. "You carry a curse into my home before you even cross the threshold," she said, without greeting. "I can smell it on your coat. 2 men, yes? One who drank first, and one who touched what the first man left behind." The Duke, startled into silence for a moment, finally managed, "How do you know that?" "Because it is an old curse, dressed in new cruelty," Marin said, turning back into her cottage and gesturing for him to follow. "Someone paid dearly for this, someone with more coin than conscience. And I will tell you plainly, your grace, I do not know who cast it upon your household, but I know what it will do if left untreated. It will hollow your friend and your physician from the inside, until nothing remains but the shell that once held them. Weeks, perhaps, no longer." The Duke's chest tightened. "Then tell me how to save them." Marin studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether he deserved the answer, or perhaps whether he could bear the cost of it. "There is a flower," she said finally, "the whisper rose. It grows in only one place in these lands, the hallowed spring, deep in the mountains to the west. Its petals, properly prepared, can draw a curse of this nature out of the blood entirely. But I warn you, Duke of Aldrich, the hallowed spring does not give its treasures freely. Many have gone in search of the whisper rose. Few have returned. I don't care what it costs me." "You should," Marin said quietly, "because it will not only cost you. The spring is guarded, not by beasts, though there are beasts enough in those mountains, but by something older and stranger. The veiled queen holds dominion over the hallowed spring, and she does not give gifts. She trades. and her trades are rarely kind. The Duke thought of Ashby's shaking hands, of Merrow's fading eyes, and felt no hesitation at all. "Then I will trade whatever she asks." Old Marin studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as if she had already known this would be his answer, and perhaps, in some way only a healer of her strange gifts could understand, she had. "Then go with caution, and go quickly," she said. "The longer the curse sits in their blood, the more it takes root. And Duke, bring back more roses than you think you need." Curses of this kind rarely arrive with only one intended victim in mind. He did not fully understand her warning until much later. By then, it would nearly cost him everything. The journey to the hallowed spring took the better part of a week, through terrain that grew steadily more hostile with every mile. Narrow mountain paths lined with loose scree, forests where the trees seemed to lean inward as if listening, and nights so cold that even a roaring fire barely kept the frost from the edges of the bedroll. The Duke's manservant, a steady young man named Willem, proved braver than his years suggested, though even he grew visibly shaken as the journey wore on. On the fourth night, something moved through their camp that neither man could clearly see, only a shifting darkness among the trees, and a low sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a voice, calling the Duke's name in a tone that made the hair on his arms rise. They did not sleep again until dawn. On the sixth day, they reached what the old maps called the Hallowed Spring, though nothing about it resembled the peaceful image the name conjured. It was a wide basin of impossibly clear water, ringed by white stone, glowing faintly even in daylight, with a light that seemed to come from beneath the surface rather than above it. Around its edges grew flowers unlike anything the Duke had ever seen, silver-petaled things that seemed to shiver even without wind. And standing at the center of it all, upon a small island of stone, reached by a narrow bridge of the same pale rock, stood a woman who was not entirely a woman. She was tall, taller than any person had a right to be, and draped in something between fabric and mist, a veil obscuring the upper half of her face, so that only her mouth and chin were visible, pale as the stone around her. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing softly off the surrounding cliffs. "Another mortal comes seeking my roses," she said, and though there was no visible malice in her tone, there was no warmth in it either, only a vast, ancient patience, the kind that made the Duke feel suddenly very small. "Tell me, Duke of Aldrich, what will you give me for what you want?" He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times on the journey, imagining he would offer gold, land, anything material a mortal ruler could summon. But standing before her now, he understood instantly that such things meant nothing here. "Name your price," he said instead. "Whatever it is within my power to give, it is yours." The veiled queen tilted her head, considering him the way one might consider a curious insect. "Careful, mortal. That is a dangerous offer to make to something like me. I have 2 men dying because of a curse meant for me," the Duke said, his voice steady despite the cold fear coiling in his stomach. "I will not leave here without the means to save them." For a long moment, the veiled queen said nothing. Then, slowly, the corner of her visible mouth curved. Not quite a smile, not quite something crueler. "Very well," she said. "I will give you whisper roses, enough to cure your friend and your healer both, and a few roses more, since something tells me you will need them before this is through. In return, you will owe me a debt, to be called upon at a time and in a form of my choosing. Not your life, not your son's life, but something dear to you nonetheless. Do you accept?" The Duke thought of Ashby's terrified whispers, of Merrow's trembling hands, of Theo, asleep and safe at home, utterly unaware of the danger circling closer to their family with every passing day. "I accept." The veiled queen's smile widened, just slightly, just enough to send a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Then take what you came for," she said, gesturing toward the silver flowers ringing the spring. "And go quickly, Duke of Aldrich. Your household needs you more than you know. Someone circles it even now, waiting for you to be far from home." The Duke froze. "What do you mean?" But the veiled queen only turned away, drifting back toward the mist from which she'd come, offering no further answer, leaving the Duke with nothing but a satchel full of glowing roses and a fear that clawed at his chest all the way down the mountain. He rode for home faster than he had ever ridden in his life. While the Duke raced against time in the mountains, Aldrich Hall carried on in uneasy quiet. Theo, the Duke's 7-year-old son, was too young to fully understand why the household staff seemed so tense, why his father had left so suddenly, why Lord Ashby and old Dr. Merrow had not been seen in days. He only knew that his nursemaid watched him more closely than usual, and that the halls felt colder somehow, even with fires lit in every room. He did not know that a woman was watching over him from just beyond the estate grounds, a woman the household believed long gone. Eleanor had once served at Aldrich Hall as a governess, beloved by Theo and quietly trusted by the Duke, before an incident nearly a year prior that the household staff still spoke of only in hushed, uncertain tones. She had nearly died, a fall from a balcony that everyone assumed was an accident, though Eleanor herself had always privately suspected otherwise. She had left Aldrich Hall to recover with distant relations, and most assumed she would never return. What no one knew was that Eleanor had never truly left the area at all. She had taken a small room in the village nearby, watching the estate from a careful distance, unable to shake the conviction that whatever had pushed her from that balcony had not finished its work. She told herself it was foolishness. She told herself a dozen times to move on, to rebuild her life elsewhere, far from the family that had once employed her. She never quite managed to leave. It was on the 5th night of the Duke's absence that Eleanor, walking the tree line as she often did in the evenings, out of habit more than purpose, noticed something wrong. A figure moved along the estate's eastern wall, not a servant, not a guard on his usual rounds, but someone deliberately keeping to shadow, testing a section of the wall where the stones had crumbled with age. Her heart went cold with recognition, even before she could name why. She had seen this kind of movement before. Careful, patient, predatory. It was the same quality of stillness she remembered from the night of her fall, a presence she'd sensed just before she went over that balcony railing, though she'd never been able to prove anyone had been there at all. She did not hesitate. She ran. By the time she reached the servants' entrance, breathless and gasping out a warning, the household staff on night duty looked at her as though she were a ghost. "Eleanor, what are you—" "There's someone at the eastern wall," she gasped. "Where is Theo? Where is the boy?" The question sent a ripple of alarm through the small night staff, and within moments, 2 guards were dispatched toward the nursery, while Eleanor, unable to simply wait and hope, ran ahead of them, taking the servants' stairs 2 at a time, her old familiarity with the house serving her better than any guard's memorized patrol route. She reached the nursery just as a gloved hand was closing over Theo's mouth. The man, cloaked, his face obscured, clearly hired rather than personally invested in the task, had already lifted the boy half out of his bed when Eleanor burst through the door. Theo's eyes were wide with terror above the hand muffling his cries. Eleanor did not think. She simply acted, seizing the heavy iron candlestick from the bedside table and swinging it with every ounce of strength her fear could summon. It struck the kidnapper across the shoulder, hard enough to make him stagger and loosen his grip. Theo wrenched free, stumbling toward Eleanor with a sob of pure relief. "Run," she told him, pushing him behind her toward the door. "Run to the guards, now." The kidnapper lunged for her instead, perhaps calculating that a governess would be easier prey than a fleeing child. But Eleanor had spent a year replaying her own near death in her mind. imagining 100 times what she might have done differently had she seen her attacker coming. She was not the same frightened young woman who had gone over that balcony without a fight. She drove the candlestick into his ribs, then again across his forearm as he grabbed for her wrist, and by the time the guards finally arrived, drawn by Theo's cries echoing down the corridor, the kidnapper had already abandoned his attempt entirely, diving through the nursery window and disappearing into the dark grounds beyond, one arm clearly injured, his face still hidden. He was gone before the guards could catch more than a glimpse of his fleeing shadow. Theo clung to Eleanor, shaking, and she held him tightly, her own hands trembling now that the danger had passed, and the full weight of what had nearly happened came crashing down on her. "You're safe," she whispered into his hair, over and over, as much to steady herself as him. "You're safe now, I promise." She did not yet know who had sent the kidnapper. She did not yet know that the man responsible was the same one who, months earlier, had likely arranged her own fall from that balcony, eliminating, or attempting to eliminate, anyone who stood even tangentially between himself and the Aldrich fortune. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not be leaving the area again, not while that boy remained in danger. The Duke returned to Aldrich Hall 2 days later, half mad with worry, after receiving word by messenger of the attempted kidnapping, arriving to find his household in a state of controlled chaos. Guards doubled at every entrance. Theo kept constantly within sight of at least 2 trusted adults, and Eleanor, whom he had not seen in nearly a year, quietly ensconced in the nursery with his son as though she had never left. There was no time for a proper reunion. The Duke thanked her with a fervor that left her faintly embarrassed, then turned immediately to the business of administering the Whisper Roses to Ashby and Dr. Merrow, both of whom had continued to deteriorate in his absence. Old Marin's instructions, carefully followed, called for the petals to be steeped and administered over 3 days. And by the second day, both men showed the first genuine signs of improvement, their trembling easing, their eyes clearing, their broken murmurs slowly resolving back into coherent speech. It was, by any measure, a triumph, but the Duke found little room for relief, consumed instead by a colder, more immediate fury. Someone within his own household, or close enough to it, had provided information that made the kidnapping attempt possible. The kidnapper had known exactly which window led to the nursery, exactly which section of the eastern wall had gone unrepaired, exactly which nights the guard rotation left a gap in coverage. That kind of knowledge did not come from a stranger. The Duke began quietly investigating his own staff, cross-referencing schedules, questioning guards, examining who among his household had access to such specific details. It was during this investigation that his steward, a man named Pratt, who had served the family faithfully for over a decade, began behaving strangely, avoiding the Duke's eye, flinching at unexpected questions, growing pale whenever the kidnapping was discussed. The Duke confronted him directly, alone, in his study, 3 days after Theo's near abduction. "Pratt," he said quietly, "I need you to tell me the truth about something." Pratt's hands, the Duke noticed, were shaking. "Your Grace, someone told the kidnapper about the eastern wall, about the guard rotation, about which window led to my son's nursery." The Duke's voice, though controlled, carried an edge that made Pratt visibly flinch. "I have narrowed the list of people with access to that information considerably, Pratt, and your name sits uncomfortably close to the top of it." For a long moment, Pratt said nothing at all. Then, slowly, something in him seemed to break, his shoulders slumping, his carefully maintained composure crumbling into something raw and desperate. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered. "You have to believe me, Your Grace. I never imagined he would try to hurt the boy. I thought it was only information. Only small things. I told myself it couldn't matter so much." The Duke felt something cold settle in his chest. "Told who, Pratt? Who have you been speaking with?" Pratt's eyes filled with tears, of shame, of fear, of something that looked uncomfortably like relief at finally being caught. "Lord Fenwick," he admitted. "It was Lord Fenwick, Your Grace. He came to me nearly a year ago, not long after Miss Eleanor's fall. He said he only wanted to know small things, your schedule, your correspondence, minor household matters. He paid well. And my daughter," his voice cracked entirely. "My daughter has been ill for 2 years, Your Grace. The physicians in the city, the treatments, I could not afford them on a steward's wages. Not without help. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I was only sharing gossip, nothing that could truly hurt anyone. And when he asked about the nursery windows, about the guard rotations, did that still seem harmless to you, Pratt?" Pratt broke down entirely then, sinking into a chair without waiting for permission, his whole body shaking with sobs. "I refused him at first. I swear to you, I refused. But he threatened to expose what I had already told him, to ruin me, to see me imprisoned for treason against the household. And where would that leave my daughter then? I was trapped, Your Grace. I see now there was no path that did not lead to disaster, but I could not see it then. I could only see her, dying, and no way to save her except through his money." The Duke stood in silence for a long moment, torn between fury and something that, despite everything, resembled pity. Pratt's crime was real. A child had very nearly been taken, very nearly harmed, because of information this man had provided. And yet the desperation in his voice, the raw guilt written across every line of his face, was not the performance of a man trying to save himself. It was the collapse of a man who had been quietly drowning for years and had finally, catastrophically, been pulled under. "You will help me end this," the Duke said finally, his voice hard, but no longer purely furious. "You will tell me everything you know about Fenwick, his plans, his methods, anyone else he has recruited. And you will help me gather proof of his crimes, proof that will hold in a court of law. Do this, Pratt, and I will see that your daughter receives whatever care she needs, regardless of what becomes of you afterward. Refuse, and I promise you, you will face the full weight of what you have done alone." Pratt looked up at him, tears still streaming down his face, and nodded fervently. "Yes, yes, Your Grace. Anything. I will tell you everything I know." It was, the Duke would later realize, the first real crack in Fenwick's carefully constructed plan, and it would prove to be the beginning of his undoing. With Pratt's cooperation, the Duke's investigation moved quickly. Pratt revealed the location of letters he had exchanged with Fenwick, carefully hidden correspondence that Fenwick, in his arrogance, had never insisted be destroyed, perhaps believing his position and reputation made him untouchable. He revealed the name of the man Fenwick had hired to poison the wine, a disgraced apothecary who, once located and questioned by the Duke's men, confessed everything in exchange for leniency. He revealed, too, that the kidnapper who had fled through Theo's nursery window was a mercenary Fenwick had used before. The same man, in fact, who Pratt suspected, though could not prove, had been responsible for Eleanor's fall from the balcony nearly a year earlier. Eleanor, when told of this suspicion, said nothing for a long moment, simply staring at the fire in the study where the Duke had gathered his closest allies to review the growing case against Fenwick. Then, quietly, she said, "I always knew. I could never explain how I knew, but I knew that fall was no accident." "I'm sorry," the Duke said, and meant it deeply. "I should have investigated more thoroughly at the time. I failed you." "You believe me now," Eleanor said simply. "That matters more than I can say." It was a moment of quiet trust between them, one that would make what came later all the more painful, though neither of them could have known that yet. Over the following 2 weeks, the case against Fenwick grew steadily stronger. Letters were authenticated. The apothecary's confession was recorded before witnesses. The mercenary, tracked down through information provided by Pratt, was captured attempting to flee the region and, faced with overwhelming evidence, confessed to both the kidnapping attempt and, indeed, to pushing Eleanor from the balcony the previous year on Fenwick's orders, having been told, falsely, that she had discovered incriminating information about Fenwick's dealings and needed to be silenced before she could report it. Eleanor absorbed this news with a strange, hollow calm. She had spent a year doubting her own memory of that night, wondering if she had imagined the presence she'd sensed just before falling. To finally have confirmation, to know she had not been foolish, had not been paranoid, was almost more disorienting than the original fall itself had been. "He tried to kill me because he thought I knew something," she said quietly to the Duke, the evening the mercenary's confession was recorded. "I didn't know anything at all. I was simply an inconvenience, standing too close to the family he wanted to destroy." "That's over now," the Duke said. "Whatever happens next, he will answer for what he's done to you, to Ashby, to Merrow, to my son. I promise you that." With the evidence assembled, Pratt's testimony, the apothecary's confession, the mercenary's confession, and the physical letters connecting Fenwick to every stage of the conspiracy, the Duke made the decision to confront Fenwick directly, accompanied by a contingent of guards and a formal writ demanding his surrender to face charges before the regional magistrate. Fenwick, for his part, seemed almost to have expected it. The Duke arrived at Fenwick's estate at dawn, the pale morning light casting long shadows across the courtyard as his guards took positions around the property's exits. Fenwick met him not with panic, but with a strange, brittle composure, the demeanor of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind, even if he had never truly believed it would arrive. "Cousin," Fenwick said, standing in his study doorway, a glass of wine already in hand, despite the early hour. "I confess, I did not expect the pleasure of your company so soon. You know why I've come. I imagine you'll tell me, regardless of what I know." Fenwick's smile did not reach his eyes. "Do come in. Let us speak like civilized men, before your guards decide to drag me out like a common criminal." The Duke stepped inside, laying the writ and a bundle of the gathered evidence on the desk between them. "Poisoned wine meant for me. A kidnapping attempt on my son. An attempt on Eleanor's life a year ago, when she came too close to your scheme without even knowing it. I have confessions, Fenwick, from your apothecary, from your mercenary, from Pratt, whom you blackmailed for over a year using his daughter's illness against him." For a long moment, Fenwick said nothing, simply studying the papers on the desk with an expression the Duke could not quite read. Not shock, not quite fear, but something closer to weary resignation, as though a performance he had maintained for years had finally, exhaustingly, come to its end. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, bitter sound with no real humor in it. "Do you know what it is like," Fenwick said quietly, "to watch a fortune that should have been yours, handed instead to a branch of the family that never wanted for anything? To smile at every christening, every wedding, every triumph, knowing that had circumstances fallen only slightly differently, you would be the one standing where they stand?" He set down his glass with exaggerated care. "Yes, I sent the wine. I hired the mercenary. I would have eliminated your son myself if it had come to that, and God forgive me, I nearly convinced myself I could live with it. Why, Theo?" The Duke's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "He's a child. He has never wronged you in his life. Because as long as he lives, the Aldrich fortune will never be mine," Fenwick said simply, without a trace of remorse. "It was never about the boy himself. It was about what his existence represents. Every door closed to me, every possibility I was denied since the day I was born to the wrong branch of this family." The confession, delivered so plainly, so without regret, settled something cold and final in the Duke's chest. Whatever thin hope he might have carried that his cousin's actions had been born of some misunderstanding, some desperation that might yet be reasoned with, evaporated entirely. "You will answer for this before the magistrate," the Duke said. "Guards." But Fenwick moved faster than anyone anticipated. In one swift motion, he seized Pratt, who had accompanied the Duke's party, having insisted on being present to face the man who had manipulated him for over a year, and produced a small blade from his sleeve, pressing it against the steward's throat before the guards could react. "Back," Fenwick snarled. All pretense of civility gone now, his eyes wild with the particular desperation of a man who has finally run out of options. "Back, all of you, or I swear I will cut his throat right here." Pratt went utterly still, terror written across his face, but he did not beg. "Do what you must, Your Grace," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the blade at his throat. "Do not let him escape on my account." "No one is dying today," the Duke said, holding up a hand to stop his guards from advancing further, his mind racing for any option that did not end in bloodshed. "Fenwick, think clearly. Where do you imagine you can go? Every road from this estate will be watched within the hour. You cannot outrun what you've done." "Then I'll die trying," Fenwick spat, already backing toward the study's side door, dragging Pratt with him. "But I will not hang for this. I will not give you the satisfaction." He fled through the side door, pulling Pratt along, and though the Duke's guards gave chase immediately, Fenwick had clearly planned this contingency. A horse, waiting saddled near the estate's rear gate, a path through the woods he knew better than any pursuer. What followed was a desperate, hours-long pursuit across the countryside, the Duke himself riding at the head of his men, refusing to slow despite exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that Pratt's life hung in the balance with every passing mile. Fenwick, cornered repeatedly and slipping free each time through sheer desperate cunning, finally made his fatal error attempting to cross a swollen river at its narrowest ford, his horse stumbling on the slick rocks beneath the current. In the chaos of the crossing, Pratt managed to wrench free from Fenwick's grip, stumbling to the riverbank as the Duke's men closed in. Fenwick, alone now, and with nowhere left to run, was finally pulled from his horse and restrained, still shouting curses at the family he had spent years trying to destroy. It was over. Fenwick's trial before the regional magistrate was, by all accounts, a swift affair. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Pratt's detailed testimony, corroborated by physical letters in Fenwick's own hand, the apothecary's confession regarding the poisoned wine, the mercenary's confession regarding both the kidnapping attempt and the assault on Eleanor a year prior, and Fenwick's own admission, witnessed by multiple guards, of his intent to eliminate Theo entirely. He was convicted on every count and sentenced to death, a verdict he received with the same brittle, defiant composure he had worn since the moment of his capture, offering no final remorse, no plea for mercy, only a last, bitter remark that the fortune he had wanted so badly would now belong to a family he considered undeserving of it forever. But the conspiracy, it soon became clear, extended further than Fenwick alone. During the process of settling Fenwick's considerable debts far larger than his own estate could reasonably explain, investigators discovered a pattern of substantial, secretive payments flowing into his accounts over the past several years, far beyond what his own resources could have generated. Tracing the source of these funds led, after weeks of careful investigation, to a wealthy financier named Josiah Croft, a man with no obvious connection to the Aldrich family at all, but with old, buried grievances against them stretching back 2 generations. A business dispute involving Croft's father that had cost the man his fortune and, eventually, his life. Croft, it emerged, had been the true architect behind much of Fenwick's campaign, providing not just the money, but much of the patient, calculated strategy that Fenwick's own bitter impulsiveness had lacked. Letters recovered from Fenwick's estate, once properly cross-referenced with Croft's known correspondence, revealed a partnership stretching back nearly 3 years. Croft supplying resources and cold calculation, Fenwick supplying the personal grievance and access to the family. Confronted with the letters, Croft attempted to flee the country entirely, but was intercepted at a coastal port before he could board a ship bound for the continent. His own trial, held weeks after Fenwick's execution, proved similarly swift once the full extent of the correspondence was presented, and Croft, unlike his late partner, offered a full confession in a desperate, ultimately unsuccessful attempt to secure leniency. He was convicted and sentenced to a lifetime of imprisonment. The full conspiracy against House Aldrich finally, completely unraveled after years of quiet plotting. At Aldrich Hall, the news was met with a strange, exhausted relief, the particular quiet that follows the end of a long and terrible ordeal, when the body and mind have not yet fully caught up to the fact that the danger has truly passed. Ashby and Dr. Merrow, both fully recovered from the curse, now that its architects had been brought to justice, returned to something resembling their old selves, though both would carry faint reminders of that terrible ordeal for the rest of their lives. Pratt, true to the Duke's promise, was granted the funds necessary for his daughter's continued medical care, though he insisted on resigning his position as steward, unable to shake the guilt of what his desperation had nearly cost the family. Theo, remarkably resilient as children often are, slowly returned to his usual bright energy, though he refused for months afterward to sleep with his nursery window unlatched, a small habit that would linger long after the larger fear had faded. And Eleanor, vindicated at last, her year of quiet suspicion finally proven true, found herself, for the first time since her fall, welcomed back fully into the household she had never truly wanted to leave. Peace, it seemed, had finally returned to Aldrich Hall. It would not last. On the morning of his execution, Fenwick asked to see the Duke one final time. It was an unusual request, and the Duke very nearly refused it. What more, after all, could possibly remain to be said between them? But something in him, some lingering need to understand the full shape of the bitterness that had nearly cost his household everything, made him agree. They spoke in a small stone chamber, adjoining the courtyard, where the sentence would soon be carried out, guards stationed at the door, the grey morning light falling harsh and unforgiving through a narrow window. "I did not ask you here for forgiveness," Fenwick said, before the Duke could speak. "I know better than to expect it, and I am not certain I would know what to do with it, regardless. I asked you here because I find, in these final hours, that I want you to understand something you have perhaps already guessed, but which I have never said aloud." "Then say it," the Duke replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I did not hate you," Fenwick said quietly. "Whatever else you believe of me, believe that. I hated the shape of a life I was never given the chance to have. You simply happened to be standing where that life should have been. It was never truly personal, cousin, though I understand entirely why it must feel that way to you. You tried to kill me. You cursed my closest friend and my physician. You tried to have my son taken from his bed." The Duke's voice hardened. "Forgive me if I find the distinction meaningless." Fenwick's mouth twisted into something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "I do not ask you to find it meaningful. I only wish to say it, once, before the opportunity was gone forever. Perhaps it changes nothing. Perhaps it was never going to." He paused, studying the Duke with an expression that, for just a moment, seemed to hold something almost like genuine regret. "Take care of the boy. Whatever I believed about my own claim to this family's fortune, he never deserved to be caught in the middle of it. That much, at least, I can say honestly." The Duke said nothing further, unable to summon any response that felt adequate to the moment, and after a long, silent pause, he turned and left the chamber without a backward glance. He did not watch the execution. He returned instead to Aldrich Hall, to Theo, to the household he had nearly lost piece by piece to one man's decades of quiet, corrosive grievance. And he held his son a little longer than usual that evening, grateful beyond words that the boy would grow up never fully understanding how close disaster had truly come. Fenwick's final words, relayed to him later by the guards who had witnessed the execution, offered no further insight, no dramatic confession, No last plea for the mercy he had told the Duke he did not expect. He had simply gone quietly, his bitterness spent, his ambition finally, permanently extinguished. A grim and sobering end to a conspiracy that had begun so many years earlier, with nothing more than a young man's unhealed conviction that the world owed him more than it had ever been willing to give. Before we continue, there's a night we need to go back to. The night that started all of this for Eleanor. Long before the wine, long before the curse, long before anyone else in this story understood what was already circling Aldrich Hall. It happened nearly 2 years before Fenwick's trial, on an ordinary evening that gave no warning at all of what was coming. Eleanor had been governess to Theo for almost a year by then, a position she had come to love more than she had expected, finding in the household's warmth something her own quiet, solitary upbringing had never quite provided. She had gone out that evening onto the west balcony, as she often did after Theo's bedtime, to enjoy a few minutes of solitude beneath the stars before retiring herself. She did not hear anyone approach. That was the detail that would haunt her for months afterward, replayed over and over in the dark hours before sleep, the utter, seamless silence of it, as though whoever had come for her that night had practiced moving unseen through grand houses many times before. One moment, she stood at the railing, looking out over the darkened gardens. The next, something struck her hard between the shoulder blades, and the world tilted sideways with terrifying speed. She did not remember the fall itself, only the sensation of weightlessness, the sick lurch of understanding what was happening a half-second too late to do anything about it, and then a blinding impact that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. She woke 3 days later in a physician's care, her body a landscape of broken bone and deep bruising, told by everyone around her, gently, sympathetically, and entirely incorrectly, that she had suffered a terrible accident, a loose stone, a moment's carelessness in the dark. No one had seen anyone else on the balcony. No one believed her when she insisted, through the haze of fever and pain, that she had felt hands against her back before she fell. "You were alone up there, my dear," the household's aging nursemaid had told her gently, holding her hand as she wept in confusion and fear. No one else was seen anywhere near that balcony all evening. It was an accident, a terrible, terrible accident. Eleanor had wanted to believe it. It would have been so much easier to believe it, to accept the tidy, blameless explanation and simply focus on healing rather than carrying forward a suspicion no one else seemed willing to entertain. But some deep, animal certainty in her refused to let the memory soften into uncertainty, no matter how many times well-meaning voices suggested that fear and pain had simply distorted her recollection of the moment. She left Aldrich Hall as soon as she was well enough to travel, ostensibly to recover fully with distant relations, though in truth she could not bear to remain in a household that did not believe her, surrounded by people who looked at her with pity rather than the wary concern her instincts insisted the situation actually warranted. She told herself 100 times over those following months that she was being foolish, that trauma played tricks on the mind, that there was no reasonable explanation for why anyone would want to harm a mere governess with no fortune, no title, and no apparent enemies in the world. She did not yet know about the Aldrich inheritance, about Fenwick's decades of bitter, quiet grievance, about how close her own position had once brought her, entirely without her knowledge, to information that might have exposed his early planning had she simply been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, watching something she was never meant to see. She only knew that she could not fully leave, that some stubborn, watchful part of her refused to travel more than a day's ride from the household she had been dismissed, in her own mind, from properly protecting. She took a small room in the village, near the estate, under a name that was not quite her own, telling herself each week that she would move on properly next week, and never quite managing it. It was that same stubborn refusal to abandon her post, unpaid, unacknowledged, unrequested by anyone, that had placed her close enough to notice a shadow moving along the estate's eastern wall on the very night Fenwick's hired mercenary came for Theo. Nothing about that vigilance had been rewarded, in the end, with anything beyond suspicion and a second unjust dismissal. And yet, looking back on it later, Eleanor would come to understand that her quiet, unrecognized watchfulness, sustained through a year of doubt, isolation, and unhealed injury, had been the single thread holding Theo's safety together during the months the Duke remained unaware of the danger circling his own household. She had never asked for gratitude. She had never asked for anything at all. It was, perhaps, exactly that quality, a loyalty entirely unmoved by reward or recognition, that made the Duke's later accusation cut so very deep. Not merely because it was false, but because it suggested, however briefly, that none of her quiet sacrifice had ever truly been seen at all. It had been seen, in the end. It simply took the household far too long and far too much pain to properly say so. 3 months passed in a kind of gentle, hard-won normalcy. Aldrich Hall, so recently a place of curses and conspiracy, slowly filled again with the ordinary sounds of a household at peace. Theo's laughter echoing through the gardens, Ashby's booming voice returning to its old, familiar volume during his frequent visits, Dr. Merrow resuming his rounds, with only a slight lingering tremor in his left hand to mark what he'd survived. Eleanor had settled back into her role with the family, though not formally as governess. Theo, older now and increasingly independent, required less constant supervision, but as something the household staff had taken to quietly calling, with clear affection, the lady who watches over Aldrich Hall. She helped where she was needed, kept a careful eye on Theo, and had earned, over those 3 months, a level of trust from the Duke that bordered on genuine friendship. It was this very trust that made what happened next so devastating. The Duke possessed a particular heirloom, a small gold pendant, passed down through 5 generations of Aldrich men, carried always in an inner coat pocket, rather than worn, a private habit, rather than a display of wealth. It held little material value compared to the estate's other treasures, but its sentimental weight was immense. It had belonged to his father and to his father's father before him, and the Duke had promised, quietly, to pass it to Theo on his 18th birthday. One afternoon, while Eleanor tidied the Duke's private chambers as she often did, a task she had taken on herself, finding the quiet, methodical work soothing after months of chaos, she reached to straighten his coat, draped over a chair, and in doing so, unknowingly, knocked the pendant loose from its inner pocket. It fell without a sound onto the thick carpet, rolled beneath a heavy oak cabinet, and lay hidden in the shadows, utterly unnoticed by Eleanor, who continued her tidying without the faintest idea that anything had gone wrong at all. She left the room perhaps 20 minutes later, entirely unaware. Not long after, the Duke's chief servant, a man named Harwick, who had served the household for nearly 6 years, entered the chamber, carrying the Duke's afternoon meal. Setting the tray down, his eye caught a faint glint beneath the cabinet, gold, unmistakably, catching the light from the window. Curious, he knelt and retrieved it, turning the small pendant over in his fingers. He knew immediately what it was. He knew, too, exactly what it was worth. Not merely in coin, though it would fetch a considerable sum from the right buyer, but in the Duke's private estimation, a fact that made it, in Harwick's calculating mind, almost more valuable as leverage than as gold. He should have returned it immediately. He told himself, in the moment, that he was simply curious, simply admiring the craftsmanship, and would set it on the Duke's desk before leaving the room. He did not set it on the desk. Instead, glancing once toward the door to confirm he was unobserved, Harwick slipped the pendant into his own pocket and left the chamber as though nothing at all had happened, already turning over in his mind the various ways he might quietly sell such a distinctive item without drawing suspicion back to himself. It was, in the grand scheme of the household's recent trials, a small and almost pathetic betrayal, born not of grand conspiracy or bitter grievance, but of simple, ordinary greed, seizing an opportunity that had quite literally rolled to his feet. But its consequences would prove nearly as devastating as anything Fenwick had orchestrated, because when the Duke discovered the pendant missing 2 days later, there was only one name that came immediately, unfairly, and completely to mind. Eleanor had been the last person in his chambers before the loss was noticed. The Duke noticed the pendant's absence on a quiet evening, reaching instinctively into his coat pocket out of long habit, only to find it empty. His first reaction was mild confusion rather than alarm. Surely he had simply misplaced it, left it in another coat, perhaps set it on his desk during some distracted moment. But a thorough search of his chambers, conducted personally and with mounting unease, turned up nothing. The pendant was gone. He questioned his household staff carefully, methodically, trying to retrace who had entered his chambers over the previous days. The list, fortunately, was short. His valet, who assisted him with dressing each morning and had no known access to the chamber outside those hours. Harwick, who delivered meals, but whom the Duke had trusted implicitly for years without a single prior incident. And Eleanor, who had been tidying the room the very afternoon the pendant likely went missing. The Duke did not want to suspect Eleanor. He told himself this firmly, repeatedly, as the uncomfortable weight of circumstance settled over him. She had saved his son's life. She had proven her loyalty beyond any reasonable doubt during the ordeal with Fenwick. And yet, grief and stress and the lingering paranoia of a household so recently under siege have a way of eroding even well-earned trust, and as the Duke turned the matter over in his mind, a small, insidious voice began to whisper questions he did not want to entertain. She was the last one in the room. She has access to every corner of this house. And what, truly, do you know of her circumstances since her fall? What debts she might carry? What desperation might have crept in during that year she spent recovering, alone, away from the household's support? He confronted her directly, in his study, 3 days after noticing the loss. The same room, though he did not consciously register the parallel, where he had once confronted Pratt over a very different betrayal. "Eleanor," he began, his voice carefully controlled, though she could immediately sense the tension beneath it. "I need to ask you about my father's pendant, the gold one I carry in my coat. Have you seen it?" Eleanor blinked, genuinely confused. "Your pendant?" "No, Your Grace. I haven't seen it since. I don't believe I've ever handled it directly." "Why do you ask?" "It's gone missing," the Duke said, "and you were the last person in my chambers before I noticed its absence." The implication landed between them, like a physical blow. Eleanor's confusion shifted rapidly into something closer to disbelief, then hurt, as the meaning of his words fully registered. "You think I took it," she said quietly. "I am not accusing you of anything," the Duke said, though the very fact that he felt the need to say so revealed exactly how far his suspicion had already traveled. "I am simply asking whether you might have seen it, whether it might have been misplaced during your tidying." "I would never take anything that belongs to you or Theo," Eleanor said, her voice trembling now with a mixture of anger and genuine hurt. "After everything, after the fall, after the attack on Theo, after everything I have done for this family, without ever once asking for anything in return, you truly believe I would steal from you?" "I don't know what to believe," the Duke admitted, and the honesty of the admission, rather than reassuring her, seemed only to confirm her worst fear, that despite everything, despite months of rebuilt trust, some fundamental doubt about her still lingered in his mind. "The pendant is gone, Eleanor, and you were the last one in the room. What would you have me think?" "I would have you trust me," she said simply, "as I have trusted you, as I have proven, again and again, that I deserve." But trust, once shaken by circumstance and old grief, and the lingering paranoia of a household that had survived one conspiracy already, proved harder to hold on to than either of them wanted to believe. The Duke, unable to fully silence that insidious inner voice, unable to produce any other explanation for the pendant's disappearance, made a decision in the heat of frustration and hurt pride that he would come to regret more deeply than almost any other choice in his life. "I think," he said, his voice hardening, "that you should leave Aldrich Hall. Immediately." Eleanor stared at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, without another word of protest, she turned and left the study, her chin held high, despite the tears she refused to let fall in front of him, gathering what little she owned within the hour, and departing the estate before nightfall, dismissed, once again, from the household she had given everything to protect. She did not know, walking away from Aldrich Hall for what she believed might be the final time, that the truth was already unraveling behind her, hidden beneath an oak cabinet, waiting to be discovered. She did not know that her departure would set into motion a chain of events that would nearly destroy everything all over again. Eleanor walked away from Aldrich Hall with nothing but a single traveling bag and a heart hollowed out by a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound she had suffered that year. She had survived a fall meant to kill her. She had risked her life to save a child who was not her own. She had asked for nothing in return beyond the simple dignity of being believed, and even that, it seemed, had proven too much to expect. She had no clear destination in mind. She simply walked, following the road away from the estate as the afternoon light faded into evening, her mind replaying the Duke's words over and over, each repetition sharpening the hurt rather than dulling it. "You were the last one in the room. What would you have me think?" She had given him every reason to think otherwise. It hadn't mattered. It was nearly dark when she stopped at a small roadside inn to rest, too exhausted and heartsick to continue walking without pause. And it was there, entirely by chance, that she encountered a face from her distant past. A tall, weathered man with familiar grey eyes, seated alone near the inn's modest hearth, who looked up as she entered and went suddenly, completely still. "Eleanor?" She turned, startled, and found herself staring into the face of a cousin she had not seen in over 15 years. Daniel Vance, her mother's nephew, who had left their family's modest estate as a young man to seek his fortune abroad, and had, as far as Eleanor knew, never returned. "Daniel," she could hardly believe it, "I thought you were still overseas." "I returned nearly 2 years ago," he said, rising from his seat, studying her with an expression of clear concern. "Eleanor, you look, forgive me, but you look as though you've been crying. What's happened?" The kindness in his voice, so unexpected after the coldness of the Duke's accusation, broke something loose in her that she had been holding tightly in check since leaving Aldrich Hall. She found herself, over the course of the following hour, recounting the entire ordeal to her cousin. Not just the false accusation and dismissal, but everything that had preceded it. The fall from the balcony, the kidnapping attempt on Theo, the year of quiet vigilance she had maintained out of pure loyalty to a family that had, in the end, discarded her over a piece of missing gold without a single moment's genuine benefit of the doubt. Daniel listened in increasingly grim silence, his jaw tightening with every new detail, and by the time Eleanor finished, something dark and protective had settled over his features. "He accused you of theft," Daniel said slowly, "after you saved his son's life. After you nearly died protecting his family from a conspiracy he himself failed to notice for months. And his response to that loyalty was to throw you out into the road without so much as a proper investigation." "He was hurt," Eleanor said, though even to her own ears, the defense sounded hollow. "The pendant belonged to his father. I understand why he was upset. Being upset does not excuse cruelty," Daniel said sharply. "Eleanor, I have not seen you in 15 years, and even I can see how much you have sacrificed for that family. He owes you an apology, at the very least." He owes you far more than that, in truth. Something in Daniel's tone, in the fierce protectiveness radiating from him, resonated with a part of Eleanor that had been suppressed for months beneath duty and loyalty and quiet self-sacrifice. The part of her that remembered, with sudden and startling clarity, exactly how much she had given, and exactly how little she had received in return. "What would you have me do?" she asked quietly. "I cannot force him to believe me." Daniel was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice had taken on a quality Eleanor did not immediately recognize. Calm, deliberate, and unsettlingly cold. "Perhaps not," he said, "but perhaps he needs to understand, truly understand, what it feels like to lose something he cannot bear to lose. Perhaps then he might finally grasp the weight of what he did to you." "Daniel, what are you suggesting?" "His son," Daniel said quietly. "Not to harm him, Eleanor. I would never suggest harming a child, and I know you would never allow it regardless. But to take him, briefly, quietly, and let the Duke feel for a single day the terror of nearly losing everything he holds dear. The same terror you must have felt on his behalf, over and over, only to be repaid with suspicion and dismissal. Let him understand, in the only language men like him seem to hear, exactly what he threw away when he cast you out." Eleanor recoiled instinctively. "That's madness. I could never—" "Could you not?" Daniel's voice remained soft, almost gentle, which made the words somehow more persuasive than if he had shouted them. "After everything you sacrificed? After everything you nearly died for? He didn't even grant you a proper investigation, Eleanor. He simply decided, in a moment of wounded pride, that you were disposable. Do you truly believe he deserves your continued loyalty after that?" Eleanor sat in agonized silence, torn between the residual loyalty she still carried for Theo, for the household she had protected at such cost, and the raw, aching hurt of an injustice that had cut far deeper than she had allowed herself to fully acknowledge until this very moment, hearing it reflected back at her through her cousin's righteous anger. "No one would be harmed," Daniel pressed gently. "We would simply borrow him for a single day, send word immediately that he is safe, and return him the moment the Duke has been made to understand. It is not revenge, Eleanor. It is a lesson, a necessary one." Exhausted, heartbroken, and for the first time in months, allowing herself to feel the full weight of an injustice she had been too dutiful to properly grieve, Eleanor found her resistance, piece by piece, beginning to crumble. "He would never forgive me," she whispered. "He has already shown you exactly what his forgiveness is worth," Daniel said quietly. "Let him learn, just once, what it costs to lose someone without cause. Let him learn it before he does it again, to someone who cannot fight back as well as you can." By the time the fire had burned low, and the inn had gone quiet around them, Eleanor, against every instinct that had once made her the fiercest protector Theo had ever known, had reluctantly agreed. She did not yet know that the plan would never need to be carried out at all. Back at Aldrich Hall, the Duke's household had not remained still in the days following Eleanor's dismissal. Theo, upon learning that Eleanor had been sent away, had reacted with a fury and grief that startled everyone who witnessed it, refusing meals, refusing to speak to his father for the better part of 2 days, insisting through hot, furious tears that Eleanor would never, ever steal from them, and that his father had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The Duke, for his part, found himself increasingly haunted by the same doubt, unable to shake the memory of Eleanor's face in the moment he'd accused her, not the guilty flinch of someone caught, but the genuine, wounded disbelief of someone utterly blindsided by an accusation she had never seen coming. He told himself, repeatedly, that circumstance had left him no other reasonable conclusion. He found the reassurance growing thinner with each passing day. It was Harwick's own greed, in the end, that unraveled the truth. Confident that enough time had passed for suspicion to have settled elsewhere, Harwick made contact with a jeweler in a neighboring town, known for asking few questions about the provenance of unusual items, hoping to quietly sell the distinctive gold pendant for a considerable sum. The jeweler, however, recognized the piece immediately, having seen it once, years earlier, when the Duke's own father had commissioned minor repairs to its clasp, and, wary of becoming entangled in what was clearly a stolen item connected to a noble household, quietly sent word to Aldrich Hall rather than risk the transaction himself. The Duke's guards apprehended Harwick within the day, the pendant found still in his possession, and brought him before the Duke in chains, all pretense of loyal service instantly and permanently abandoned. "Explain yourself," the Duke demanded, his voice tight with a fury that had been building steadily since the moment he received word of what had been found. Harwick, cornered and with no plausible defense remaining, offered no resistance to the truth. "I found it on the floor, Your Grace, beneath the cabinet in your chambers, the day I brought your afternoon meal. I don't know how it came to be there. I only know I saw it, and He faltered. Shame, finally, belatedly, catching up to greed. "I took it. I meant to sell it quietly. I never intended for anyone else to be blamed." The Duke's blood ran cold. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you let Eleanor be dismissed, accused of your crime, and said nothing?" "I did not know she had been accused until after she was already gone," Harwick admitted, though the excuse did little to soften the Duke's fury. "By the time I understood what had happened, I feared confessing would only see me hanged, rather than merely dismissed. I am not proud of my silence, Your Grace, but I was afraid." The Duke's hands curled into fists at his sides, less from the theft itself, a relatively small loss in the grand scheme of everything the household had survived, than from the devastating realization crashing over him in full force. He had accused, condemned, and cast out the very woman who had twice saved his son's life, on nothing more than circumstantial proximity, while the true thief had stood silently by and let her take the blame. "Get him out of my sight," the Duke said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He is dismissed from this household, permanently, and will face whatever consequences the magistrate deems appropriate for his theft and his silence both." As the guards led Harwick away, the Duke sank into a chair, the full weight of his error settling over him like a physical thing. He had wronged Eleanor, deeply, unforgivably, after everything she had sacrificed for his family, and she was gone, somewhere on the road, with no way of knowing the truth had finally come to light. He needed to find her, immediately. "Send riders," he ordered, already moving toward the door, urgency overtaking every other thought. "Every road, every direction. Find Eleanor and bring her back to Aldrich Hall. Tell her the truth has been discovered. Tell her," his voice caught, briefly, on the weight of what he needed her to understand. "Tell her I am sorry. Tell her I was wrong, and I need the chance to make it right." The riders departed within the hour, fanning out across every road leading from the estate, racing against a clock none of them could see, unaware that somewhere ahead of them, in a quiet room at a roadside inn, Eleanor was already being drawn, reluctantly and against every instinct that had once defined her, toward a decision that could undo everything she had ever sacrificed to protect. Dawn broke grey and cold over the road leading away from Aldrich Hall, and Eleanor woke that morning with a knot of dread sitting heavy in her stomach, the particular sick tightness that comes from having agreed, in a moment of raw grief, to something her deeper conscience had never truly accepted. Daniel had already risen, moving with quiet purpose around their small room at the inn, outlining the plan in the calm, methodical tone of a man who had clearly given the matter far more thought than a single night's conversation should have allowed. They would travel back toward the estate grounds under cover of the early morning mist, wait for an opportunity when Theo was in the gardens with only a single attendant, and take him quietly, without struggle, without harm. A temporary absence, Daniel insisted again and again, nothing more. He will be perfectly safe. Daniel said, checking the modest supplies he had gathered. "We'll send word to the Duke within hours. A single day, Eleanor. That is all it will take for him to understand." Eleanor said nothing, staring at the small bag she had packed the night before, with hands that would not quite stop trembling. Every instinct that had once sent her sprinting up the servants' stairs to save Theo from a real kidnapper now screamed in protest at the plan she had agreed to. And yet the raw wound of the Duke's accusation, the humiliation of her dismissal, kept her rooted in place, unable to fully voice the growing certainty that this was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, regardless of how justified her anger might be. "I am not like Fennec," she thought suddenly, the realization arriving with the force of cold water. "I am not like the man who tried to take Theo to punish a family for what he believed he was owed. I cannot become that, no matter how deeply I've been wronged." She opened her mouth to tell Daniel she could not go through with it, that whatever hurt the Duke had caused her, however unjust his accusation had been, using an innocent child to punish him, crossed a line she was not willing to cross, not even for the sake of her own wounded pride. Before she could speak, the sound of galloping hooves thundered up the road outside the inn, fast and urgent, followed moments later by raised voices calling her name. "Eleanor! Eleanor of Aldrich Hall! Are you within?" Daniel went instantly tense, his hand moving toward the small bag containing their supplies as though calculating an escape. But Eleanor was already moving toward the window, her heart hammering with a confusion of dread and desperate hope. She recognized the voice, one of the Duke's own household guards, a man she had known for years, his tone carrying none of the menace she might have expected had the household simply come to arrest her for a theft she had not committed. She threw open the door before he could knock, finding not one guard, but 4, all mounted, all bearing the unmistakable urgency of men who had ridden through the night without rest. "Thank God!" the lead rider said, swinging down from his horse with visible relief. "We've searched every road since yesterday evening. Eleanor, you must return to Aldrich Hall at once." "Why?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended, old hurt bleeding through despite the fear now tightening in her chest. "Has something happened to Theo?" "Theo is safe," the guard said quickly, seeing her alarm. "This concerns you, Eleanor. The truth has come to light. Harwick, the chief servant, was caught attempting to sell the Duke's pendant. He confessed to everything. He found it beneath a cabinet in the Duke's chambers and took it for himself and said nothing while you were blamed and cast out in his place." Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, the words taking a long moment to fully penetrate the fog of grief and exhaustion that had settled over her since her dismissal. The truth has come to light. She had spent the entire journey from Aldrich Hall convinced she would never be believed, that the accusation would follow her forever, an unjust stain she would carry regardless of her innocence. And now, standing in the cold morning air outside a roadside inn, she found herself abruptly, dizzyingly vindicated. "The Duke knows," she said slowly. "He knows I didn't take it. He knows," the guard confirmed. "And he has sent us to find you and bring you home, Eleanor, with an urgency I have rarely seen from him. He wishes to apologize to you himself and to make amends for what was done to you." Behind her, Daniel had gone very still, watching this exchange with an expression Eleanor could not fully read, something caught between relief and a strange, tight frustration, as though the sudden resolution of her vindication had robbed him of a purpose he had, in some deep and troubled way, needed to fulfill. "Eleanor," he said quietly, once the guards had stepped back to allow them a private word, "you do not have to go. You do not owe him your forgiveness simply because the truth finally happened to surface. You could walk away entirely, and no one would fault you for it." Eleanor turned to look at her cousin, really looked at him, for the first time since their reunion the previous evening, seeing beneath the protective fury that had drawn her so powerfully toward his plan the previous night. She saw, now, the darker current running beneath his righteous anger, a bitterness that seemed to run deeper than the single night's outrage on her behalf could fully explain. "Daniel," she said slowly, "why did it matter so much to you? My humiliation, I mean. We had not seen each other in 15 years, and yet you were prepared to help me kidnap a child on a single night's acquaintance with my grievance. Why?" For a long moment, Daniel said nothing, and something in his weathered face shifted. Old grief surfacing beneath old anger, the particular pain of a man who has carried a private wound for far longer than a single evening's conversation could explain. "Because I know what it is to be discarded by someone who should have trusted you," he said finally, quietly. "Because I watched someone I loved dearly, many years ago, suffer an injustice not unlike your own, and I was powerless to help him. When you told me your story last night, Eleanor, I did not see only your pain. I saw his." Eleanor did not yet understand what he meant, could not yet have known the astonishing connection those words obscured. But the guard was waiting. The horses were saddled, and Theo, sweet, frightened, grieving Theo, needed to know she was safe and returning home. "Come with me," she said to Daniel. "Whatever this is, whatever old wound you're carrying, I think it deserves to be understood properly, rather than acted on in anger before dawn on a cold roadside. Come to Aldrich Hall with me, please." Daniel hesitated, some old caution warring visibly with a curiosity he could not quite suppress, and finally, slowly, he nodded. Neither of them yet suspected just how significant that decision would prove to be. The ride back to Aldrich Hall passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the early morning mist slowly burning away beneath a pale winter sun as the small party made their way along the familiar road. Eleanor said little, her mind cycling between relief at her vindication and a lingering, unresolved hurt that no apology, however sincere, could fully erase in a single conversation. Daniel rode beside her, equally quiet, his earlier fervor entirely gone now, replaced by something more contemplative, a man clearly turning old memories over in his mind, testing their edges against new information he had not expected to encounter that morning. They reached the estate grounds by mid-morning, and Eleanor felt her chest tighten at the familiar sight of Aldrich Hall's grey towers rising against the winter sky. The same sight that had once meant safety and belonging, now tangled inextricably with the memory of standing in the Duke's study, hearing him tell her to leave. Theo was the first to reach her, having apparently kept vigil at a window for much of the morning, sprinting across the courtyard the moment her horse came into view, and throwing himself against her the instant she dismounted, sobbing with a relief so overwhelming it took her several long moments to properly calm him. "I told him you would never steal from us," Theo said fiercely, still clinging to her. "I told him he was wrong. Everyone kept telling me to be patient. But I knew. I always knew." "I know you did," Eleanor said softly, holding him close, feeling some of her own tightly held composure finally begin to loosen. "Thank you for believing in me, even when it was hard." It was then that the Duke himself emerged from the hall, moving with a speed and visible urgency that struck Eleanor as almost unfamiliar. This was not the composed, measured man who had once calmly negotiated with a supernatural queen for his friend's life, but someone stripped of pretense entirely, driven by guilt too raw to hide behind his usual careful control. He stopped a short distance away, as though uncertain of his welcome, his eyes moving from Eleanor to the boy still clinging to her, and something in his expression, a naked, unguarded regret, made the anger Eleanor had carried through the long night begin, slowly and against her own better judgment, to soften. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, "I am more sorry than I know how to properly express. I should never have doubted you. Not for a moment. Not after everything you have done for this family, everything you have sacrificed without ever once asking anything of us in return. I let fear and grief and old paranoia cloud my judgment, and I wronged you terribly for it. I understand if you cannot forgive me. I understand if you never wish to see me again. But I needed you to hear, directly from me, exactly how deeply I regret what I did." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, aware of the guards, the servants, Theo still holding tightly to her hand, all watching this exchange with held breath. She thought of the roadside inn, of Daniel's quiet, persuasive fury, of how close she had come, in a single night of raw grief, to becoming something she could never have forgiven herself for becoming. "You hurt me deeply," she said finally. "Honestly, I want you to understand that clearly, before we speak of forgiveness. You did not simply doubt me. You dismissed me without a proper investigation, after everything I had already proven about my loyalty to this family. That wound will not vanish simply because the truth has now come to light." "I understand," the Duke said quietly. "I do not expect it to. But," Eleanor continued, and something in her posture softened further, "I also understand what it is to act rashly, out of grief and fear. I nearly made a terrible mistake myself, last night, born from the very same wound you inflicted. I think we are neither of us as far from each other's failures as we might like to believe." She glanced briefly, meaningfully, toward Daniel, who stood a short distance behind her, watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. "Your mistake came from haste, rather than malice, Your Grace. I believe that. It does not erase the hurt, but it does, I think, leave room for forgiveness, given time." The Duke's shoulders sagged with visible relief, though he did not press for more than she had offered. "Thank you," he said simply. "Whatever time you need, Eleanor, I will wait for it gladly. You have more than earned that patience from me." It was only then, as the tension of the reunion began to ease into something more settled, that the Duke's attention shifted to the man standing quietly behind Eleanor, and his entire expression transformed, disbelief and dawning recognition washing over his features in rapid succession. "Daniel?" he breathed. "Daniel Vance?" Daniel went very still. "You know my name." "Know it?" The Duke crossed the courtyard in several quick strides, staring at Daniel with an intensity that startled everyone watching. "Daniel, it's me. It's Edmund. We grew up together, before your family moved north when we were boys. Do you not remember? We used to steal apples from the orchard behind the old chapel. You broke your arm falling from the stable roof, trying to prove you could jump into the hay bales below. I searched for you for years after we lost touch, Daniel. I never knew what became of you." For a long moment, Daniel simply stared, decades of assumed loss and old grief visibly warring across his weathered features. And then, slowly, unmistakable recognition dawned in his own eyes. "Edmund," he said finally, wonderingly, as though testing whether the name still fit the man standing before him. "Edmund, is it truly you? I heard, years ago, that the Aldrich line had passed to a cousin named for the old Duke's grandfather, but I never imagined—" He shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. "I never imagined it was you." They spoke long into the afternoon, seated together in the Duke's study, the same room that had witnessed both Pratt's desperate confession and Eleanor's unjust dismissal, now filled with a very different kind of reckoning. Theo, sensing the significance of the moment, even without fully understanding it, curled quietly into a chair near the fire, listening with wide, attentive eyes as two men who had once been inseparable boys slowly rebuilt the bridge that 15 years and an ocean of distance had worn away. "I always wondered what became of you," the Duke said, pouring 2 glasses of wine with hands that still trembled faintly from the morning's overwhelming events. "Your family left so suddenly. I wrote letters for nearly 2 years afterward, though I never received a single reply. My father forbade it," Daniel said quietly, and something dark passed briefly across his face. "That is, in truth, the wound Eleanor's story reopened for me last night, Edmund. My father was steward to a minor lord in the north, a man not unlike yourself in station, though far less honorable in character. When a valuable item went missing from that lord's estate, a jeweled brooch, if I recall correctly, suspicion fell immediately upon my father, despite 20 years of loyal service. He was dismissed without any real investigation, his reputation destroyed, and we were forced to relocate entirely, our family's prospects ruined by an accusation that was, as it later emerged, entirely false. The Lord's own son had taken the brooch to settle a gambling debt and allowed my father to bear the blame rather than confess his own failing. The Duke's face went pale, with dawning understanding. "Daniel, I had no idea. My father never fully recovered from the humiliation," Daniel continued, his voice tightening with old grief. "He died several years later, still burdened by a reputation he had never deserved to lose, still waiting for an apology that never came. When Eleanor told me her story last night, a loyal servant of a noble house, cast out without proper investigation over a missing item of value, I did not see only her pain, Edmund. I saw my father's, playing out again, decades later, in a household I once considered a second home. I could not bear to watch it happen twice without acting." "And so you convinced her to help you take Theo," the Duke said slowly, understanding now the full, tangled weight of grief and old injustice that had driven his oldest friend to encourage such a desperate, dangerous plan. "I am not proud of it," Daniel admitted, meeting the Duke's eyes directly. "I convinced myself, in the heat of old grief resurfacing, that it was justice rather than cruelty. I see now, with a clearer head, that I very nearly made both Eleanor and myself into something no better than the man who wronged you both, Fenwick, or my father's dishonest young lord. I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that the truth surfaced before we acted on it." The Duke set down his glass, studying his old friend with an expression that mingled sorrow, gratitude, and something like renewed wonder at the strange, circuitous path that had brought them back together after so many lost years. "I am sorry for your father's suffering," he said quietly. "Truly sorry, Daniel. No one deserves to carry an injustice like that to their grave, unresolved, and I am deeply grateful that you stopped yourselves before that same injustice could echo forward into another generation of pain." He paused, considering something carefully before continuing. "I would like to make amends, if you'll permit me, not merely to Eleanor, though certainly to her most of all, but to your family's memory as well. Your father served his household with integrity for 20 years, only to be discarded over another man's crime. That injustice deserves acknowledgement, even now, even so many years later." Daniel's throat worked for a moment before he could speak. "That means more to me than you know, Edmund, truly." Eleanor, who had listened to this entire exchange in thoughtful silence, finally spoke, her voice gentle, but carrying the quiet clarity of someone who had spent a sleepless night grappling with exactly these questions of justice, loyalty, and forgiveness. "I think," she said slowly, "that all three of us have learned something important today, painful as it has been to learn it. Suspicion, however understandable in the moment, causes wounds that outlast the circumstances that provoked it. Grief and fear make fertile ground for injustice, whether it's a duke doubting a loyal friend, or a son avenging his father's humiliation through means that would only create new victims." She looked between the two men, her expression softening. "I would like to believe we have all chosen, in the end, to step back from the edge of that particular cliff. That has to count for something." "It counts for a great deal," the Duke said quietly, "more than I know how to properly repay." The weeks that followed brought a slow, careful rebuilding. Not the swift, dramatic resolution of a single tearful reconciliation, but the patient, day-by-day work of restoring trust that had been genuinely damaged, on both sides, by fear and hasty judgment. The Duke made a point, in those weeks, of demonstrating his regard for Eleanor not through grand gestures, but through consistent, quiet respect, consulting her judgment on matters concerning Theo's upbringing, thanking her openly and often in front of the household staff for her past sacrifices, and ensuring that no whisper of the old, false accusation lingered among the servants who had witnessed her dismissal. Harwick's public disgrace and dismissal, delivered before the full household with an unambiguous account of his theft and his silence, served as its own form of restitution, a clear, unmistakable signal that the household's true loyalty had never wavered, whatever a momentary lapse in the Duke's own judgment might have suggested. Eleanor, for her part, found her old affection for the household, for Theo especially, but for the Duke as well, and for the strange, hard-won sense of belonging Aldrich Hall had come to represent in her life, gradually reasserting itself beneath the lingering hurt. She did not forget what had happened. She did not pretend the wound had vanished simply because the truth had emerged, but she found, day by day, that the Duke's genuine remorse, consistently demonstrated rather than merely spoken once and then abandoned, slowly rebuilt something she had feared permanently broken. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself drawn increasingly into the daily rhythms of Aldrich Hall, reluctant at first to impose upon a reunion he still could hardly believe had occurred, but gradually, gently persuaded by both Eleanor and the Duke himself to extend his stay. He and Edmund spent long evenings reconstructing the 15 lost years between them. Daniel's travels abroad, his eventual return to a homeland he had feared might no longer feel like home. The slow, careful work of rebuilding a life after his father's death had left the family's fortunes considerably diminished. The Duke's own losses, his wife's death, the long years of quiet grief that had shaped him into the careful, sometimes guarded man Daniel was only now coming to fully know again. Theo, delighted by the presence of this newly discovered family friend, attached himself to Daniel with the easy, uncomplicated affection children often extend to adults who take genuine interest in them. Following him around the estate grounds with a stream of questions about his travels, his adventures, the various strange lands he had visited during his years abroad. "You should stay," Theo told him bluntly, one afternoon in the gardens, with the particular directness only a child can manage. "Father needs more friends who remember him from before he was so serious all the time." Daniel had laughed at that, genuinely surprised into warmth. "Is that so? He told me stories about stealing apples," Theo said solemnly. "I didn't know he used to do things like that. He's always so careful now." "Grief tends to do that to a person," Daniel said, more to himself than to the boy, though Theo nodded as though he understood perfectly well regardless. "It makes us careful in ways we weren't before. Sometimes it takes an old friend to remind us we were once capable of recklessness too." The Duke, observing this easy friendship blossoming between his son and his newly rediscovered childhood friend, found himself considering an idea that had been slowly taking shape in his mind since the day of Daniel's arrival, one he broached carefully, several weeks later, once he judged the moment properly ready. The Duke found Daniel alone one evening, in the estate's small library, a book open on his lap that he did not appear to be reading, his gaze fixed instead on the fire crackling in the hearth, lost in thoughts the Duke could only guess at. "May I join you?" Daniel glanced up, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. "Of course, Edmund, always." The Duke settled into the chair, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. "I've been considering something," he said finally, "and I wanted to raise it with you directly, rather than allow it to remain only half-formed in my own mind any longer. Aldrich Hall has been without a steward since Pratt's resignation. I have managed the household's affairs myself in the interim, with the help of my staff, but the estate has grown considerably since my father's time, and I find myself increasingly stretched thin, trying to oversee everything personally." "I imagine that's true," Daniel said, though he did not yet seem to grasp where the conversation was heading. "I would like you to consider taking the position," the Duke said, watching his old friend's face carefully for his reaction. "Chief Steward of Aldrich Hall, with full authority over the estate's daily management, its finances, its staff. I trust you, Daniel, not merely because of our old friendship, though that matters deeply to me, but because I have watched, these past weeks, the character of the man you have become. You stopped yourself and Eleanor from a terrible mistake, even in the grip of righteous anger over your father's old injustice. You have shown Theo genuine care and treated my household with respect since the moment you arrived. I can think of no one I would trust more fully with the responsibility." Daniel sat in stunned silence for a long moment, clearly turning the offer over in his mind with the same careful consideration he seemed to bring to every important decision. "Edmund, I appreciate this more than I can properly express, but are you certain? I have no formal experience managing an estate of this size. My own family's fortunes, as you well know, were considerably diminished by the time I came of age." "Pratt had decades of experience," the Duke said quietly, "and it was not experience that ultimately failed this household. It was desperation exploited by a man without conscience. I would rather have a steward of proven character who must learn certain skills than one of proven skill whose character can be so easily exploited by someone willing to threaten what he loves most. You have already proven, in the most difficult circumstances imaginable, exactly the kind of character I want overseeing this household's affairs." "And if I make mistakes?" Daniel asked. "Learning any new responsibility invites error. Then we will address those mistakes together, as friends, the way we once addressed every childhood mistake together, before your family's departure separated us," the Duke said, a faint, warm smile finally breaking through his earlier solemnity. "I am not asking for perfection, Daniel. I am asking for the same loyalty and integrity you have already shown this household, applied now to its formal management. Will you accept?" Daniel's eyes, when he finally looked up, were bright with an emotion he did not attempt to hide. "My father spent 20 years serving a household with exactly that kind of loyalty, only to be discarded without a second thought when it became convenient for someone else's crime to be hidden," he said quietly. "To have that same loyalty recognized and rewarded, rather than exploited and discarded. I confess, Edmund, I hardly know how to properly respond to such an offer." "Say yes," the Duke suggested gently. A slow smile spread across Daniel's weathered face, the first truly unguarded smile the Duke had seen from him since their reunion. "Yes," he said. "Yes, Edmund. I accept, gladly, and I promise you, I will not take this trust lightly." "I know you won't," the Duke said, extending his hand, which Daniel clasped firmly, sealing an agreement that felt, to both men, like far more than a simple professional arrangement, a symbolic mending of old, broken threads, a restoration of something precious that circumstance had once torn away without either of their consent. News of Daniel's appointment spread through the household quickly, met with general approval from staff who had already come to respect the newcomer's quiet competence and evident care for the family's well-being during his weeks at Aldrich Hall. Theo, upon hearing the news, let out a whoop of delight that echoed through the halls, immediately declaring that Daniel would now have to stay forever, a proclamation Daniel accepted with visible, genuine warmth. Eleanor, watching this new arrangement take shape, felt something in her own carefully guarded heart continue its slow thaw. She had spent the past year oscillating between quiet vigilance and quiet grief, uncertain of her place within a household that had, in its most painful moment, so readily doubted her loyalty. Watching the Duke extend such profound trust to Daniel, a trust earned not through decades of prior service, but through demonstrated character in a single, difficult trial, offered her a kind of reassurance she had not realized she still needed. Proof that the Duke had truly learned from his earlier failure, that his capacity for trust had not calcified into permanent suspicion, but had instead grown wiser, more careful, more genuinely attentive to character rather than mere circumstance. As the season turned from winter into the first tentative warmth of spring, Aldrich Hall settled into a rhythm of peace, more genuine and more hard-won than any it had known in years. Lord Ashby, fully recovered from the curse that had once nearly claimed his mind, returned to his old habit of frequent, boisterous visits. though he confessed privately to the Duke, late one evening over wine, that he still sometimes woke from nightmares of shadows moving within the walls, a lingering echo of the curse's grip on his mind that no amount of physical recovery had entirely erased. "It fades," Dr. Merrow assured him, on one such visit, the old physician's own hand still betraying a faint, permanent tremor from his own ordeal. "Slowly, but it fades. I find myself less troubled by it now than I was even 2 months ago. Give it time, Ashby. Time heals what magic and medicine together cannot fully mend." Pratt, though no longer in the Duke's direct service, received regular word from the household regarding his daughter's continued medical care, funded fully, as the Duke had promised, despite Pratt's own insistence on stepping down from his position. The girl's condition, while not entirely cured, had stabilized considerably under the care of physicians the Duke's resources had made accessible. A small, genuine mercy, salvaged from an otherwise painful chapter of betrayal and desperation. Pratt himself had taken up a modest position managing accounts for a merchant in a nearby town, rebuilding his life slowly, carrying his guilt as a private, permanent companion, but grateful beyond words for the mercy the Duke had shown him despite everything. Fenwick's estate, seized by the Crown following his execution, was eventually redistributed among distant relations with no connection to his crimes, the bitter legacy of his grievance finally, fully extinguished. Croft, serving his lifetime sentence in a fortress prison, far from the comforts he had once commanded, reportedly spent his remaining years in bitter, unrepentant silence, refusing every visitor, including his own estranged family, a fitting, if grim, coda to a conspiracy built entirely on old, unresolved grievance, rather than any genuine grief that might have earned sympathy. Old Marin, when the Duke returned to the Hollow Wood some months later to properly thank her for her guidance, offered only a knowing, weathered smile in response to his gratitude. "Curses like the one Fenwick commissioned rarely end cleanly, Duke of Aldrich," she said, settling into her familiar rocking chair beside the crooked hearth. "They leave echoes in the mind of the man who nearly lost himself to madness, in the household torn briefly apart by suspicion and grief, in the steward who nearly lost everything to blackmail, in the servant who cast aside his own conscience for a moment's greed. A curse of that magnitude does not simply vanish once its immediate victims are cured. It ripples outward, testing every relationship it touches, revealing exactly which bonds are strong enough to survive the strain and which were never as sturdy as they appeared." "And the debt I owe the Veiled Queen?" the Duke asked, a question that had lingered uneasily in the back of his mind since his journey to the hallowed spring. "When will she come to collect it?" Marin's expression grew, briefly, more serious. "When she chooses, and not a moment before. The Veiled Queen does not forget her bargains, Duke of Aldrich, nor does she rush to collect them. She will come when the debt serves some purpose beyond mere payment, when the collecting itself teaches you something you still need to learn. I would not spend your remaining days dreading that reckoning. I would simply live well enough that, whatever she eventually asks of you, you will have no regrets standing in the way of paying it." The Duke considered this advice carefully on his ride home, watching the familiar hills of his estate rise into view as evening settled over the countryside, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he could accept it without undue fear. He had faced curses, conspiracies, and the far more mundane but no less painful failure of his own hasty judgment against someone who deserved better from him. He had learned, through all of it, that trust rebuilt, with care and consistency, proved sturdier than trust simply assumed and never truly tested. Whatever the Veiled Queen eventually asked of him, he suspected he would face it with the same hard-won wisdom that had carried him through every trial Aldrich Hall had already survived. Spring deepened into summer, and Aldrich Hall settled fully into the kind of contented rhythm that only follows genuine hardship survived together. Theo grew taller, bolder, his nightmares of the nursery window finally fading as the memory of that terrifying night receded further into the safe distance of the past. He spent his afternoons trailing after Daniel through the estate's ledgers and storerooms, declaring with great seriousness that he intended to learn everything a chief steward needed to know, in case Daniel ever needs an assistant. Daniel, for his part, settled into his new role with a steady competence that surprised even himself, applying the same careful, principled attention to Aldrich Hall's daily affairs that had once made his own father such a beloved steward in the north, decades earlier, before injustice had stripped that devotion of its due reward. Where his father's loyalty had been discarded without a second thought, Daniel's was met, day after day, with the Duke's open trust and genuine gratitude. A correction, however delayed, that Daniel confessed one evening he had never truly expected to receive, not for himself, and certainly not on behalf of his father's long-buried memory. "I think of him often, now that I'm here," Daniel admitted to Eleanor one warm evening, the two of them walking the estate's gardens, as the sun set in long amber streaks across the western sky. "I wonder what he would think, seeing me finally granted the respect that was stolen from him. I like to imagine he would be proud. I like to imagine, somehow, that some part of him knows." "I think he would be," Eleanor said gently. "And I think, in a strange way, your father's suffering may have ultimately spared this household from repeating the same injustice twice. If you hadn't carried that old wound with you, hadn't recognized the shape of it so clearly in my own situation, would you have stopped yourself as quickly from acting on it? Would either of us have found our way back before real harm was done?" Daniel considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps not," he admitted. "Perhaps some good, however small, managed to grow from something so painful after all." Eleanor herself had found, in those quiet months, a settled peace she had not known since long before her fall from the balcony. A peace built not on the absence of all hurt, for the memory of her unjust dismissal still occasionally surfaced, sharp and unwelcome, in quiet moments. It was built instead on the slow, deliberate proof, offered daily by the Duke and by the household at large, that she was valued not merely for what she had once sacrificed, but for who she continued to be within their lives. A steady, watchful presence, Theo adored. A trusted voice, the Duke increasingly relied upon. A woman who had earned, through hardship and honesty both, a permanent place within the walls she had once nearly died defending. The Duke, watching Eleanor move through the household with her old confidence gradually restored, found himself increasingly aware of just how much her presence had come to mean to him, not merely as Theo's protector, not merely as a wronged party he owed a debt of guilt and gratitude, but as a woman whose judgment he had come to value, whose company he found himself seeking out with an eagerness he did not examine too closely. Not yet, not while the wounds of the past year still required careful, patient tending before anything more could reasonably be asked of either of them. He said nothing of this growing awareness, content for now simply to earn back, day by patient day, the trust his own hasty judgment had once so thoroughly damaged. There would be time enough, he told himself, for whatever came next. For now, it was enough that Aldrich Hall stood whole again, its people safe, its old wounds slowly, carefully healing. A year to the day after Fenwick's execution, Aldrich Hall held a modest gathering to mark the household's survival. Not a grand celebration, for the Duke had no wish to make spectacle of a period defined by so much genuine suffering, but a quiet dinner among those who had weathered the ordeal together. Ashby arrived with his usual boisterous good cheer, fully himself once more, regaling Theo with increasingly exaggerated tales of the mountain journey the Duke had undertaken to save him, much to the Duke's amused, long-suffering protest. Dr. Merrow attended as well, his tremor now barely noticeable, his careful, steady presence a quiet reminder of how far the household had traveled from the terrifying uncertainty of that first cursed night. Pratt, invited, despite his own insistence that he did not deserve such continued grace, arrived with news that brought genuine tears to more than one eye at the table. His daughter, after a year of consistent, well-funded treatment, had shown remarkable improvement, strong enough now to accompany her father on the short journey to Aldrich Hall for the first time since her illness had begun. She sat beside Theo through dinner, the two children finding easy, uncomplicated friendship despite the very different circumstances that had once threatened to tear both their families apart. Daniel presided over the household's practical affairs, with the quiet confidence of a man who had, over the past year, fully grown into a role he had once doubted his own capacity to fill, while Eleanor sat near the Duke throughout the evening in a manner the household staff had, over recent months, begun to notice and quietly speculate about, though neither the Duke nor Eleanor had yet spoken openly of whatever new understanding was slowly, carefully taking shape between them. Theo, near the evening's end, raised his cup of watered wine with the exaggerated solemnity only a child attempting to imitate adult ceremony can properly achieve, and declared, to the amusement of the entire table, "To Aldrich Hall, and to everyone who never gave up on it, even when it was very, very hard." The toast, simple as it was, captured something the entire household had come to understand deeply over the preceding year: that the true strength of a family, of a household, of any bond worth preserving, was not measured by the absence of hardship, but by the willingness of those within it to fight for one another through hardship's worst trials, to forgive one another's failures when forgiveness was honestly earned, and to rebuild, patiently and deliberately, whatever trust circumstance and fear had temporarily damaged along the way. The Duke, raising his own cup to meet his son's toast, allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, a genuine and uncomplicated sense of peace. Somewhere in the mountains to the west, past the reach of ordinary maps, the hallowed spring continued its ancient, patient glow, and the veiled queen continued her long, unhurried watch, waiting, as she had told old Marin centuries before, for the proper moment to call in a debt that had not yet come due. Whether that reckoning would arrive as challenge or as gift, whether it would test the Duke's household once more or simply confirm what it had already so thoroughly proven, remained a question only time itself could answer. At Aldrich Hall, life continued in its hard-won, patient rhythm, a household that had survived poison and madness, kidnapping and betrayal, false accusation and near-catastrophic revenge, and had emerged from every trial not unscarred, but genuinely stronger for having weathered each one honestly, together. Theo grew, as children do, carrying forward the lessons of loyalty and courage he had absorbed from watching the adults around him choose, again and again, integrity over easier paths. Eleanor and the Duke continued their slow, careful rebuilding of something that had grown, by unspoken but mutual understanding, into far more than simple gratitude. Daniel oversaw the household's daily affairs with a devotion that finally, fully honored his father's long unrewarded memory. And somewhere beyond the estate's borders, the echoes of Fenwick's bitter ambition and Croft's cold calculation faded slowly into the kind of distant, cautionary history that households tell their children as warning rather than living fear. Peace, hard-earned and carefully tended, had finally, truly returned to Aldrich Hall. Whether it would last, whether some new shadow waited in the mountains, in an old debt not yet called, in ambitions not yet born, was a story for another day. For now, the Duke, his son, and the family he had nearly lost through his own worst fear, looked forward together to whatever future still awaited them, unafraid, at last, of facing it as one. And if you go looking for Aldrich Hall today, in the hills where the story says it once stood, you won't find grey towers or misted gardens. You'll find only the shape of the lesson it left behind, that the people who stay loyal without ever asking to be thanked are usually the ones we come closest to losing, simply because their loyalty makes them easy to overlook until the very moment they're gone. Eleanor never asked for gratitude. She never asked for anything at all. And that, in the end, was exactly why she so nearly lost everything twice over. First, to a man who wanted her silenced, and then to a household that nearly forgot, in a single moment of fear, everything she had already proven. Remember that, the next time someone in your own life gives more than they ever asked to receive. Don't wait for the missing gold to turn up beneath the cabinet. Believe them first. All right, before you leave, be honest. If you were Eleanor, would you have forgiven the Duke that quickly? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear both sides. And don't forget to subscribe